Good morning and a warm welcome to our webinar on science-based targets. My name is Ralf Leister and I'm responsible at Otto for our climate protection measures in general and for science-based targets in specific. And I'm very happy that we have about 1 hour time to discuss or to share information on science-based targets and discuss some fundamental questions. For doing that, I prepared a short agenda, or to be honest, I have to say we prepared a short agenda, because when I say we, I mean myself and Leonie from Sustain, who supported us in setting our science-based targets. She will talk to you later and introduce herself as well. The agenda is summarized quite quickly. We will start with a short introduction to science-based targets. So what are they? We will share some insights into science-based targets at Otto, and I will try to convince you with the benefits of science-based targets for you as a partner. After that, Leonie will continue with the process of setting science-based targets according to SBTI, the Science-Based Targets Initiative. We will sketch the first internal steps to set a science-based target, and the challenge is that afterwards we still have time for your questions. You have the opportunity to ask questions in the meantime as well by using the F&A button, the Fragen and Answers, if you want to say it like this, button. We have the opportunity to publish those questions and answer them either in written language or by doing that verbally during the webinar. So please feel free to input your questions there. We are happy to answer them. 2 further remarks: this webinar is recorded so that you and your colleagues can rewatch it afterwards, and especially because some people are not able to join today, we wanted to give them the opportunity to watch it as well. So this will be recorded. And for everyone watching the recording, hi, thanks for joining. The second remark is that at the end of this webinar, I have a very special invitation for you. So please stay until the end of this webinar. Having said that, I would like to start with a quote of our owner, Professor Dr. Michael Otto, who said, "Responsible commerce that inspires summarizes what we have stood for many years, namely to take responsibility for people and nature." So even though sustainability and climate protection have been quite popular the last couple of years, we really have this in our DNA, which means that we integrated climate protection in 1986 at the strategic level of our company. So this is quite a history that we have, from my opinion, with sustainability. But of course, we always developed our ambitions, and our latest development is what I want to share with you today, which is science-based targets. So what are science-based targets? In short, SBTs, they are externally validated climate targets. What was important for us is that we do not just want to set ourselves targets without any validation, because to be honest, every company can say we want to be climate neutral or net zero, but we wanted to take this seriously and therefore decided for the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which quantifies the contribution that companies can make to achieving the 1.5-degree target established by the Paris Climate Conference in 2015, 10 years ago. The Science-Based Targets Initiative is mainly a collaboration of some renowned organizations, for example, CDP. I think the most famous one is the Worldwide Fund for Nature, WWF. The Science-Based Targets Initiative is an NGO, so they don't earn money. They don't earn a lot of money by validating our climate targets. They are basically an NGO. So science-based targets are quite popular in globally. Around 8,000 organizations already have validated SBTs. In Germany, where we are based, around 450 companies or organizations already validated their own science-based targets. And this number is growing quite rapidly over the last couple of years by around 100%, so basically doubling each year, hopefully for the upcoming years as well. So whenever we want to validate targets, or whenever we want to want an external organization to do something for us, we have to play by their rules. And their rules are basically defined in the greenhouse gas protocol. This is the fundamental rules that are necessary to account emissions. And they identified 3 different emission scopes that are named Scope 1, 2, and Scope 3. I briefly want to guide you through this visualization and start with Scope 1. Scope 1 emissions are basically all the emissions that are caused by the properties that we own as a company. For example, the fleet or the facilities, buildings, and things like that. Scope 2 is nearly everything that we purchase from third parties in order to operationalize what we own, which means electricity, heating, cooling for our own use. So we especially here have to look at the invoice of our our power provider and our gas provider. This is Scope 1 and 2, and this is basically what most companies are talking about when they are talking about their emissions. But you see some purple arrows here as well, which is the Scope 3 emissions, which is distinguished between upstream and downstream. And Scope 3 is mainly all the emissions that are caused by our actions that are not our own properties. So we are starting from an imaginary supply chain where we purchase some goods and services. So for example, we at Otto sell basically everything, 80 million products. And let's take a washing machine, for example. With purchased goods and services, we ask ourselves what materials are worked into this washing machine. We are asking ourselves what are the conditions under which the washing machine is basically put together in our supply chain. So is it electricity from renewable energies, or do they use electricity from coal, for example? A huge difference. Then Scope 3 also includes transportation. It includes business trips by our staff and the employee commutes daily to the office. This all is upstream, but then, as I mentioned, we have downstream emissions as well, and they are very tricky. So downstream emissions are mainly caused by products that need power. For example, the washing machine that I just mentioned. Because the power in Germany is mainly produced by green energy, around 54%, but this means 46% still is from fossil fuels. And those emissions caused by the electricity production are accounted to us as well, because we sold our customers the washing machine. Now you might wonder, wait a minute. Of course, we sold the washing machine, but there were many other companies included in the supply chain as well. Why are we responsible for the use phase emissions? Well, the tricky thing with Scope 3 is that every company in the value chain is responsible for those Scope 3 emissions. And this is something that differentiates the emission accounting from the financial accounting. They do that because they want all companies in the value chain to have the same incentive to reduce those emissions. So this is just true for Scope 3, upstream and downstream. Please try to keep that in mind. And then, of course, if we dispose the products, there are some emissions as well, but the main lever for the washing machine, for example, is the use phase. Having said that, this is theory. Let's jump into practice at Otto.de. We started our journey with SBTi in 2022, and we validated our targets last year in February. And there we've learned that we are responsible for a CO2 footprint of around 5.5 million tons of carbon emissions. And we chose for a base year of 2021 because this was the most recent year in 2022, obviously, and this was a year where we had good data quality. And what we want to do now are basically 3 things in order to tackle those emissions. And those 3 things are defined in 3 different sub-targets that are each that are each different in how important they are from us or how relevant they are for us from a CO2 perspective, which means sub-target 1 has a very thin line, just addresses around less than 1% of our emissions. On the other hand side, we have sub-target 3 with a very thick line. This stands for around 75% of our emissions, leaves sub-target 2 for around 25%. What are those sub-targets? Quite briefly summarized, sub-target 1 basically addresses scope 1 and 2 emissions, and we want to reduce them by 42% in the time frame until 2030. Then we have sub-target number 2, which addresses the supply chains of our partners. So basically your supply chains. And the reason for that is that we cannot set a goal of absolute reduction in your supply chains because we are not the ones who can influence those supply chains. This means the goal we've set here is that we want to increase the so-called supplier engagement to, we say, 50% in general by 2027. And this differentiates for third-party brands and marketplace partners. But basically, our goal is to increase the revenue from partners that have set themselves an SBT. And we can either do that by targeted growth of those partners or by convincing new partners to set a science-based target. To be honest, we might need both approaches. And the reason that we are here is that we are convinced that talking about science-based targets and climate protection might help us to achieve this target. Just to conclude, sub-target number 3, we basically put all other emissions there. This is the supply chain of our own and licensed brands and the use phase of all products we sell on Otto.de. And we want to cut those emissions by 42% within the time frame of 10 years. The tricky thing, again, about those absolute reduction targets in sub-target 1 and sub-target 3 is that we have to cut emissions by 42% independent from our growth, which means if we grow ambitiously over the next 10 years, we have to cut emissions even more intensively because in the end, we have to reduce emissions by 42% compared to a 2021 baseline. This is quite ambitious, but we would like to talk with you about sub-target number 3. So reasons why companies might set themselves a science-based target and reasons that are based on market experience, but also reasons that we want to establish on Otto.de. So let's have a look at the general benefits that companies have when they set themselves science-based targets. The first 4 are true for every company out there in the market. And as I mentioned, we at Otto want to establish new incentives for you to consider science-based targets on Otto.de. I will get to that in a minute. But before that, the first benefit is that companies credibly show that they are taking responsibility for their actions in the entire value chain. The second is we all know and we all love the legal requirements that we have either on a national basis or on a European basis or on an international basis. And we are convinced that setting science-based targets prepares for future regulations here. The third reason is our customers. Especially customers on Otto.de are convinced that they would like to delegate sustainable behavior to us as a platform. And therefore, we want to curate the required assortment to do that. So customers love when companies really show validated climate action. And the last one is on the financial perspective, and this really depends on how you are financed. But what we've learned is that setting science-based targets helps companies on the financial markets, either by getting access to resources they haven't had before, so new financing opportunities, or by reducing the interest payments they have to give to their creditors in the market. So science-based targets really can be a financing business case. As I said, all those benefits are true for all companies out there, but we at Otto are working on establishing more of those benefits to you as a partner. The first one is live since April 2025, so quite recent. We reduced the marketplace commissions for partners with SBT between 0.5 and 1 percentage points. So again, this really can be a business case for you as well. And this is just the start, since we are working on further incentives to do that. There is not much I can share about that right now, but I think the reduced marketplace commission shows that we are taking this very seriously. Other options we are evaluating are especially around the areas of visibility and the services that we are providing on Otto.de. Having said that, my part is over and I'm happy to hand over to Leonie. But before I do that, I want to send a brief reminder to you. If you have any questions, feel free to click on the F&A button. I'm very happy to answer your questions either after Leonie's part or during Leonie's part in a written language. So please feel free to do that. It's very important for us that it's not just a one-way street communication. And having said that, thanks so far. And Leonie, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Ralf. I think I have taken over the slides. I think you still need to accept that.
I don't see anything, but let me...
I'll try again.
Yes. Now you should have it.
Perfect. I can't go to the next one though.
Let me check.
You can just click for me, that's no problem.
I think now it should work.
Yes, thank you. Perfect. So a warm welcome also from my side. I'm really happy to be here. I am working at Sustain Consulting. We are a consulting company active especially in sustainability strategy. And we've helped a lot of companies on their journey towards an SBT. So I'm happy to tell you more about this topic today. Before we get into the contents, I would like to point out that there will be a standard validation pathway that I will be talking about, but also a pathway for small and medium enterprises. And these will be marked by these two colors and also icons. So whenever we talk about either of those, you will see that on the slides and also know which one is more relevant for you, because there are quite a few differences in the way towards an SBT, depending on which way you go. And before we dive into the contents, of course, it's important to know what constitutes an SME within SBTi rules. And there are two sets of requirements. The first set, you can see here in dark blue, is here especially important is how many emissions you have in scope 1 and 2. Ralf explained before that these are the emissions that occur in your own facilities or vehicles. And these need to be under 10,000 tons of CO2 to be able to follow the SME path. So this is really important. And then there's a few other rules. You can't be in the oil and gas sector or financial sector, not be covered by any other sector standards of the SBTi. And it's really important that you don't have a parent company that has to follow the standard validation pathway. So if you have a big parent company, probably you cannot follow this SME pathway. And then the second set of requirements concerns mainly economic things like employees, revenue, and assets. So this is pretty straightforward, I think. And then there is one thing I want to point out, and this is about being a flag company. What is FLAG? FLAG stands for Forestry, Land and Agriculture. And if you produce or trade land-intensive goods, which can be agricultural products, but also products that have a lot of wood as a material, then you belong, or part of your emissions belong to the FLAG sector. And there's one specific rule for that. So if this applies to you, the SBTi gives you a special, let's say, exception, because this sector can follow the SME pathway if it is small enough. That's why you need to fulfill 3 of the 4 requirements in set 2. So if you are a small enough flag company, you can still follow the SME pathway. This can be relevant for some of you, but definitely not for everyone, as land-intensive goods are, not for sure not something most of you trade. However, this is still important to mention, in my opinion. So let's start with the process of setting an SBT. There are 6 steps to this, and it starts with 2 quite formal steps. you register at the SBTi services, which is the part of the SBTi that is responsible for validating targets. This is a quite formal process, just as a commitment, because this is just handing in a letter. And once you have committed with the SBTi, there is a deadline for the target submission. So after commitment, you have 24 months to hand in your targets for validation. And then after this, the biggest phase starts, because this is about actually developing and validating your targets. And this is also something we will talk about quite a lot later on. I will therefore just briefly go over it. What does it mean to develop a target? It simply means formulating a target according to the SBTi standards. And for a company that follows the standard validation pathway, this means setting targets in all scope categories that I've talked about before. So scope 1, 2, and 3, at least for the near-term time horizon, so for a time frame until 2030, and optionally also until 2050. And then once you've developed all this and followed all the rules of the SBTi, you hand in the validation documents, which is simply an Excel sheet where you put in a lot of information on your emissions and the targets. You pay the price for the target setting process, and then about 3 to 9 months later, depending on questions the SBTi maybe has about your targets and maybe little amendments you need to do, the target will be validated. It also depends on the size of your company and how complicated your emissions are. And then the last 2 steps are also rather formal, because then you need to communicate about your targets, and the SBTi also publishes your targets. So everything is official and publicly communicated. And then after this, you are expected to annually disclose your emissions so that, especially external stakeholders have a feeling on whether you are on track or not. And then, of course, I want to focus on the differences for smaller companies. So if you follow the SME pathway, this is quite a lot easier than for bigger companies. You have to register, but there's no commitment. So you can simply register and then hand in your target whenever you're ready. There is no 2-year deadline. And then the validation process is a little easier, first of all, because you don't need to set targets for scope 3. You can focus on scope 1 and 2 in the near term. And the validation overall will be a bit easier and, of course, also cheaper. And the rest is pretty much the same. But these are definitely things that make it a bit easier for companies that don't have as much resources. And before we focus on the process again, I would like to talk a bit about the types of targets that you can set, or that the SBTi provides rules for, because there are quite, let's say, strict or quite clear rules on what kinds of targets you can set. And this is also why the SBTi is so helpful, because this makes companies be more comparable in their climate ambition, because everyone sets targets according to the rules and not according to the target ambition they think they can achieve. So what are these clear rules? You can see that we split this into scope 1, 2, and scope 3. And then we also have 2 timeframes for this. There is the near-term target horizon. I mentioned this before. This is until 2030. And then we have the net zero timeframe, which is until or latest 2050. So in scope 1 and 2, you need to achieve minus 42% until 2030. And in scope 3, it is 42% and optionally minus 25%. Why is that? The SBTi provides pathways for 1.5 degree conform targets and 2% conform targets, because scope 3 is quite difficult to reduce, and it makes up a large part of companies' emissions. Usually, especially manufacturers, will have the majority of their emissions in scope 3, and because this is so challenging, we can still follow a little bit of a less ambitious pathway until 2030, even though we would not recommend doing this, because then you just push all the reduction efforts into the future. Because as you can see, until 2050, the net zero reduction target is minus 90% for all scopes. So this is just something to consider, but you do have some freedom of decision here. We've also, we also have an example here of Decathlon, who, follows the 1.5 degree pathway in all scopes. So they committed to reduce by 42% until 2030, but they haven't committed, and they have committed to reach net zero in 2050, but have, they pretty much fulfill everything that you can see here. So let's check how this looks for smaller companies. I think I mentioned this before, you don't need to set a scope 3 target if you are an SME until 2030. So you can focus on your scope 1 and 2 emissions and reduce what you do in your own facilities and vehicles. You can also see the example on the right, which is Office Depot, is a Swedish company who committed to reduce scope 1 and 2 by 2030. And what they also commit to is to measure and reduce scope 3. And this is actually something the SBTi requires, that you don't need to set a specific target for scope 3, but you do commit to to dig a bit deeper and already check where you stand maybe, and think about how you can approach this in the future, because as I said, after 2030, you will also have to reduce scope 3 quite drastically, irrespective of the size of your company. But you do get a little bit more time if you have, probably less resources as a smaller company. So this is everything that you need to know about what targets you can actually set. We will not focus on specific sector targets. There's other types of targets, but these are the most important ones that will most likely apply to everyone in this meeting. And now let's take a step back to the process of actually validating the targets. And I would like to focus on the, let's say, formal steps here. The first step is the registration. As I mentioned, the SBTi services is the, let's say, body of the SBTi that is responsible for validating the target. This is a separate website, and you simply create an account and then fill in a lot of data about your company, which is about your business model, your revenue, some economic indicators, also scope 1 and 2 emissions, which can be a rough estimation, but still you need to provide that. Because then the SBTi assesses your data, checks if you are eligible to set targets, and classifies you as an organization. So at this point, you will also know if you can actually follow the small and medium enterprise pathway, for example, and you will also know how much you will need to pay. And this is, of course, what happens in the, let's say, front end. But for us, it's really important to mention what has to happen before that, because once you register and start the whole process, of course, things, let's say, get started, but this requires a few steps in your company to actually be able to follow the whole process with the SBTi. From our point of view, it's really important to get the commitment of your company, especially the management, but also different stakeholders you need in the organization to follow through with the whole process. So identify the people that can provide you with data and get the okay and the budget for things. So this is, for example, really important because you need to do this scope 1 and 2 screening. And for that, of course, you need to identify people that provide you with data and talk to everyone that is involved for this first emission screening. So making sure everyone is on board really early in the process will make it a lot easier later on for you. That's at least one big learning from our experience with companies in this whole sphere. And then I would like to focus on this big chunk of work that happens in the development phase of your targets. So what does developing your targets actually mean? There are 3 important steps for this. First, you need to calculate your greenhouse gas emission baseline. So you need to know where you actually stand and how many emissions you emit. Then you need to think about the level of ambition and how your target should actually look like. And afterwards, you need to think about measures to achieve these targets. I would like to focus a little bit on each of these steps. You can see this, we call it waterfall diagram on the right of the slide, and this pertains to the baseline calculation. So what does this actually mean? You need to calculate emissions for all scopes, just as Ralf explained before. They did this for Otto to know where most of their emissions lie. For lots of companies, this will be scope 3, as I mentioned. And this is pretty much setting the reference for your targets. And there are some challenges to this. Usually this is about data quality and availability. So the data you need for emissions calculation, you usually haven't collected in that way before, because of course it's a completely new type of calculation. So the data will not be stored centrally. This will take some time. You need to find the stakeholders internally that can provide you with this data. So yeah, this is just, I guess, a recommendation to start early with this. And then maybe let's talk a little bit about accuracy and level of detail, because there's different ways of doing this. You can do a really rough baseline and you can be really detailed. Of course, this is also dependent on the data you have available. And generally speaking, the SBTi doesn't require you to have like a really, really detailed baseline. However, when you think about reductions and implementing things to reduce your emissions, as you can see here on the right, for example, we kind of like usually draw this way towards 2030 and check every year where you stand with your emissions. And if you implement things to reduce emissions, but your baseline is not detailed enough, you will not be able to see the measures you implemented. So there's a fine line between being pragmatic and being detailed. And a lot of companies ask us, hey, can we just use a tool? There are so many tools out there to calculate emissions. And I think this can, of course, be helpful, but really importantly, you still need the data and need the data ready in the right format and structured before you use a tool. And the tools from our point of view are usually not like ready-made. So you also have to put a lot of work in to use a tool. And really importantly, we also want to encourage you to do some things yourself, or like encourage you that a lot is possible, especially in scope 1 and 2. Usually an Excel sheet and some information from your energy management system are a really good start to calculate scope 1 and 2. So you don't need the most sophisticated carbon accounting system to just get started. And then the second step, the level of ambition, I think this is a quite easy thing to do, because the SBTi gives you some, let's say, rules that you can that you need to follow, and then there's some decisions to be made. For example, do you want to follow the more strict pathway until 2030, or you want to follow the 2-degree pathway? Do you want to set a net zero target until 2050, or do you want to wait with that and maybe focus on 2030? So I think this is a lot about your individual case as a company. It depends on the products you produce, the level, the technology that is available to reduce emissions. It can also depend on the requirements that your clients set. We have some clients that have really strict requirements from their customers. So for them, it's not an option to follow the 2-degree pathway until 2030. And then for other companies, it's totally valid to follow the less ambitious pathway today and maybe push some of the reduction in the future. So this is something you need to figure out. And I think there is a good way for every company to do that, as long as you follow the most important rules of the SBTi. And then the last step is thinking about reduction measures. This is something the SBTi requires you to, let's say, list in a quite pragmatic way when you hand in your targets, because they want to see that you've worked with your emissions and thought about ways to reduce them, because of course setting a target is easy, but once you realize that you actually need to do a lot and also transform your company to achieve these targets, this is of course a different thing. So they just want to see that you are aware of this. And this is why we use this waterfall diagram that you can see on the right, where we simply analyze all the factors that will affect emissions of a company. And this is quite easily done. You can see that there's a baseline and then there's company growth. Ralf talked about this before. Growing as a company will, of course, increase the reduction effort you need to achieve. And then a really important factor is, of course, the things you actually do. So things you change, for example, the source of electricity that you use or that is used in your supply chain, or the materials that your products are made from. So these are all measures that you can think of to reduce your emissions. And as you can see here, there is a target gap. The example of this, this waterfall diagram doesn't get to the target because there are just some things that in this case could not be solved or reduced yet. But this is very normal. Most companies will have this picture after analyzing it because, yeah, you don't need to have a perfect plan when you start. There will be new technologies, new rules, new regulations, and different things happening until 2030 and also later on that will help you and, yeah, make you find a way to achieve these targets. But it's still good to know where you actually stand and how big the gap is and maybe how much transformational changes are necessary to achieve these targets. And I think this is a good way to get to the next slide, because I want to talk about the process of carbon accounting and climate strategies, because it's a quite iterative process. As I said, it is not a problem to have this gap because things will change over time. When you think about new measures to reduce your emissions, you will realize that you have new data requirements. And once you ask your suppliers for new data, for example, on the raw materials they use, the suppliers will be faced with these questions, not only from you, but also from other customers. So they will most probably improve the data they can provide to you over time and provide you with new data that will give you new insights about your products and new opportunities to actually implement measures and maybe ask them for other things they can change to make your products more carbon, reduce the carbon emissions of your products. So I think this is really something I want to, use to encourage you, because everyone starts somewhere and things will definitely get easier over time. I also want to very briefly focus on what comes after you set the target, because of course it's great to set a target and have this vision, but how do you actually achieve that? And we've done this with quite a few companies to anchor the targets in the organization. It is really important, of course, to have the support from the management and the shareholders, but you also need to think about your employees, definitely your suppliers and your clients, and how you can integrate them into achieving these targets. In your company, this can, for example, mean defining sub-targets and responsibilities to achieve the SBTs, maybe get some new employees on board, then also communicating internally and increasing the knowledge about the SBTi, and very importantly, also setting up KPIs and reporting processes, and maybe at some point think about an IT solution to facilitate carbon accounting if this is necessary in your case. And this sounds really complicated, but I can assure you that we've done this with different clients in a range of industries, in the textile sector, retail, food. So this is possible. I think everyone is still finding their way with this. So there's no perfect solution, but for sure, things are just developing and everyone's finding their way. Maybe a few words on why this is actually, this seems so complicated. Why should you put in the effort? One important message I want to bring about is the earlier you start, the better. Even though let's say the regulation is easing off in some areas lately, for climate, this will very much remain. We are quite sure that climate topics will be important, especially from a regulatory perspective. And also rising energy prices are something that, of course, is on everyone's minds. So for us, it's really important to encourage you that you will also be more resilient to some of these things if you start early. And of course, this can also mean that you can follow expectations of your customers a lot better, because this is also something that more and more we see that our projects come from smaller companies have requirements from their customers because they have climate targets just as Otto has. So this is definitely not something to shy away from. And I'm coming to an end here already, but I would briefly like to point out that we've collected some resources for you. This is just different sources of tools and further reading on emission screening and emissions calculation, as well as a database for emission factors. As I said, a lot can be done in Excel, and yeah, a lot can be done without a sophisticated tool. And I think these are really good starting points to do this yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leonie. And to all of those listening, I know it is a right to try to understand everything around science-based targets in less than an hour. I mean, we are talking about goals here that will accompany us as a company for around 10 years, at least in the near-term frame, in the net zero frame a little longer. So don't worry if you are a little bit overwhelmed by all this information. Now I would like to give you the opportunity to ask your questions. I sent a brief reminder, so please feel free to share your questions here in the F&A button. We are happy to answer them live in the meeting or in written language. Of course, there are some further next steps that you can now initiate depending on where you are as a company. So those are the 3 QR codes that you can see here. On the lower left end, we prepared an extensive more than one-pager. It should have been a one-pager, but there were so many advices and recommendations we collected that it's a more than one-pager. You can download it here. It basically is a step-by-step process to starting the SBTi process from a company's perspective. Then on the right-hand side, you are of course able to access Sustain and try to collaborate with them if you need any kind of support. As I said, we are very happy with the support they gave us, but just to be clear, you are not obliged to use Sustain for your climate efforts from an Otto perspective. So feel free, Sustain is just a recommendation. And in the middle, there's the exclusive invitation that I mentioned in the beginning. We are establishing a so-called SBT circle or SBT roundtable, as we call it, where we sit together with companies that are interested in SBT in a more interactive way. So this is more a virtual workshop character, if you want to call it like that. And we are sitting together every 6 to 8 weeks for starting with 1 hour. And as I said, it's an interactive format to understand your needs, to get you up to speed in a more personal environment. And we're establishing this, we established this for corporations in German language, for SMEs in German language, and because we were asked by many international companies if we can offer it in English as well, we are starting or kicking it off next week. So on July 24th, in exactly 1 week, at 10 a.m., the first English SBT roundtable will take place. So if you want to be part of that, feel free to register yourself via this QR code or just shoot me an email. My contact detail will be provided when we share the presentation as well. Since we have no questions, and I know time already progressed a little, there's at least one question, Leonie, that I would like to ask you. When we now try to put ourselves in the shoes of the audience here. So they heard a lot about science-based targets. Their head maybe is a little bit hurting after this hour because there was so many information. So what do you recommend as an immediate first step for a company that, or for a person that thinks that science-based targets might be worthwhile spending some time on in his or her company?
I mean, I think the resources we provided are a good first step to just read a little bit on the topic and let it digest all the information, let's say. And then I think the offers you provide can also help to just get in touch with others and get a feeling of, okay, there's others that have maybe the same fears or struggles. I mean, then again, I think it is also a good idea to exchange information with colleagues, because they might see, they might not be the only one who have heard or have gotten questions about this from clients, from customers. So I think getting together and assessing the status quo, and what is possible, what they think they can also get the okay from, right, from your management, and yeah, that is something I think could be good to just get a sense of the situation you're in. Yeah. And educate yourself a little.
Thank you very much, Leonie. And since you just mentioned the management, what we've learned in the last couple of months from several partners is that they needed support in order to convince their management to follow science-based targets. Because we have to be honest, science-based targets is a strategic decision. It's nothing that you can do without management noticing, because it's a huge commitment, but it's a commitment that is worth taking from our Otto perspective. So if there's anything that we can do in order to help you convince your management, is it by jumping on a call together? Is it by providing some written statements how important this is, or just by forwarding this slide deck and the recording of this webinar? Feel free to do that and feel free to reach out. We really want to understand your needs. And having said that, I think we can close this webinar a few minutes early. I'd like to thank you all for joining and for listening, either live or the recording. And I wish you all a fantastic day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.